Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This column has been written by Mr. Krishna Kumar, the former director of NCERT. In this column, the writer evaluates the impact of virtual learning on pedagogy and child psychology. See, pedagogy is nothing but the method and practice of teaching. This method of teaching, particularly teaching children, is rooted in both scientific principles and it is also an art that a good teacher should possess. So over the last few months, the method of teaching, that is pedagogy, has undergone a sea change due to the widespread adoption of virtual learning or online learning. In this column, the writer evaluates how the ongoing rapid changes in pedagogy affects childhood development and child psychology and how it disrupts established education theory. See, over the last few years, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been a lot of interest among schools, colleges and even within the government for the adoption of smart education with the deployment of technology, especially IT-based solutions. So this introduction of a new technological environment is definitely having an impact on childhood learning and child psychology, and it is also causing a disruption to established theories of education and pedagogy. See, in a traditional learning setup, the family and the school forms the primary learning ecosystem for a child. But the focus given to the adoption of smart education and the changes introduced in education because of the pandemic has led to the premature exposure of children to a new factor in the learning ecosystem, which is technology. The widespread adoption of virtual learning and online learning has exposed the children to both the pros and cons of the internet. See, even before the pandemic, schools and the government had already begun investing heavily for the adoption of smart education infrastructure. But the breakout of COVID-19 completely disrupted the education sector and it forced the world to adopt e-learning or online learning overnight. But while making this switch, schools and governments gave very little consideration for the fact that there were hardly any policies in place to regulate virtual learning, and they failed to take into account the need for protecting children, especially young children, from the perils of the internet and technology. See, the widespread adoption of e-learning after the breakout of the pandemic has activated the market forces, and it has opened up tremendous opportunities for the information technology industry in the education space or in the edtech space. But however, this leads the industry to treat the children as a part of the market, as their products are designed to serve their needs. But when the industry treats the children as just a part of the market and ignores the ethics of education and the ethics of pedagogy, then it might lead the children and even the parents to become susceptible to advertising and marketing based manipulation. It is not just the IT industry which is competing for this market, but even traditional coaching centers, schools, and other traditional players in the education sector, they are all eyeing the e-learning space, and this might lead to children being treated as a part of the market, which in turn could have an undesirable impact on the psychology of the child. Plus, when the industry is driven by the demand in the market, it ends up creating a social divide and a regional divide as well. This is very true with regard to virtual learning, because access to virtual learning is directly dependent on your location and on your income. It's a well-established fact that it is only the rich and the middle class and those in the urban areas who enjoy access to quality virtual learning platforms, whereas children from the poor families and those from the rural areas might get left behind because the industry driven by the profit motive might focus only on the market where there exists a demand for their products. Even the government has failed to regulate the space adequately, and the lack of policies and the overnight adoption of e-learning is bound to have an impact on learning and child psychology. Then there hasn't been enough debate within the government and within the education sector with regard to the perils of exposing young children to technology and internet. The significant increase in the exposure to screen time might affect the physical and mental well-being of the child. Then uninhibited access to technology devices and the internet might expose children to games, fantasy games and virtual entertainment, which might foster a gambling mindset amongst the children and expose them to violence and even pornography at a very early age. children could also become susceptible to manipulative advertisements targeted at them, and this could end up having a long-term social impact as well. Then coming to the learning part of it, traditional education theory believes in the promotion of critical inquiry and analytical skills amongst children. Critical inquiry is nothing but the ability of a child to place a certain problem in a wider context. Basically, it tests the ability of a child to take a comprehensive look at a given situation or a challenge. And this is not just an important academic skill, but it is also a very important life skill as well. Then analytical skills help you learn concepts and apply or transfer those concepts to other subjects and other spheres of life as well, including the social and human context. In a traditional schooling system, pedagogy has been designed to promote critical inquiry and analytical skills, and this has even been highlighted by the latest national education policy. But however, it is not certain as to what extent critical inquiry and analytical skills can be developed amongst children through virtual learning, and it is highly unlikely that young children might be able to learn the required social and human skills by merely depending on the virtual format. Then the writer is also concerned about the exaggerated claims being made in India about the hype and widespread adoption of technology in education in the Western countries and in other developed countries. For example, there have been reports in the Indian media that countries like Japan are switching completely to the online format and they are replacing their textbooks with digital books. However, the writer dismisses them as baseless claims because even though countries like Japan, China and other European countries are adopting technology as a part of education, they are doing it in a staggered manner based on certain policies of the government. But however, in India, the attraction of the West and the developed world has led our schools, universities and the government to blindly believe that smart education is a prerequisite and the only way through which pedagogy and learning could be improved. Accompanied with this, parental expectations and pressure is acting upon the children because especially after the breakout of the pandemic, parents have been extremely concerned about learning losses due to the long-term closure of schools and colleges. So this has opened up a wide opportunity for the industry and coaching institutions and even schools to blindly adopt technology platforms and virtual learning without giving much thought to its impact on pedagogy and child psychology. Indian parents in particular are driven by the need to push their children towards academic success, which is usually measured in the form of periodic tests. And this is where the online education market thrives. In order to match this unrealistic demand created by the parental pressure, the industry tends to forget the basics of learning and pedagogic skills, and instead it might merely focus on periodic testing, which provides for immediate results to gauge the performance of the child, which ends up pushing the parents into a false sense of belief that their children are ahead of their peers. The next biggest concern of the writer is that virtual learning does not take into account the individual needs for learning. Technology-based learning might not take into account the need for customization that would help design courses based on the individual pace of learning of each child. While this is much easier to achieve in a traditional classroom environment, it might be very difficult and complex in the virtual format. But however, the writer does acknowledge that technology-based learning and e-learning is definitely a great supplement, but he cautions the parents, the schools and the governments against the blind adoption of technology-based learning, especially when there aren't enough policies in place to regulate the sector, and promotion of learning in such an ecosystem doesn't protect children, especially young children, from the drawbacks of technology and the internet. Now let's take up a column from page number 7 that is related to Iran's nuclear program and its ongoing tensions with the United States. See, between 2000 and 2015, Iran began accelerating its development of nuclear weapons. And this nuclear weapons program of Iran aggravated the already existing hostility with the United States, because the United States saw Iran's nuclear weapons program as a regional threat and as well as a global threat, including to the national security of the United States. So this had forced the Obama administration to first impose a set of economic sanctions on Iran, and it had also run a series of covert operations along with Israel, including cyber warfare options, in order to exert limited pressure on Iran. So the Obama administration saw Iran's nuclear weapons as a threat to regional security and as well as to the national security of the United States itself. Even though the Obama administration was exerting limited pressure on Iran, it always kept the path for diplomacy open. And this is what allowed the European countries to mediate a nuclear deal known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This deal was signed in 2015 between the P5+1 countries, Iran and the European Union. P5 includes the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council and +1 refers to Germany. These countries signed the landmark Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2015, which sought to contain Iran's nuclear weapons program by limiting its enrichment capabilities. Iran agreed to the deal because economic sanctions were crippling its economy and the limited pressure tactic of the United States had worked and it had opened up a path for diplomacy. In return for Iran's willingness to accept the terms of the deal, the United States agreed to lift the economic sanctions, and this had helped in reducing tensions between US and Iran, and it also brought a sense of regional stability in the volatile Middle East region. But however, Iran's regional rivals, that is Israel and Saudi Arabia, they were unhappy with the deal because for them, Iran represents a much larger geopolitical problem and they are not just concerned about Iran's nuclear weapons. For the United States and the Western European countries, the main concern about Iran is its nuclear weapons. Whereas for Iran's regional rivals, Israel and Saudi Arabia, Iran's nuclear weapons was not the only threat, and they have always sought to counter Iran's excessive influence in the region, which allows Iran to establish itself as the leader of the Shia power bloc. This position of Iran directly challenges Saudi Arabia, which sees itself as the leader of the Sunni power bloc. Then for Israel, Iran represents an existential threat as both the countries have been fighting against each other for several decades over the Palestine issue and as well as over other regional geopolitical issues. As a part of this regional rivalry, Israel and Saudi Arabia have sponsored a number of covert attacks against Iran, and Iran has responded by sponsoring a number of non-state actors such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and other outfits which seek to target Israeli and Saudi Arabian interests. This regional influence of Iran continued to rise further after the economic sanctions were lifted post the signing of the nuclear deal. So hence, Israel and Saudi Arabia were unhappy with the Iran nuclear deal because it was allowing Iran to regain its influence back in the region. But the Western countries, particularly the US, was satisfied that it had blocked the path for nuclear weapons for Iran. But then came the Trump administration, whose interests were more aligned with that of the Israel and Saudi Arabia. See, both Israel and Saudi Arabia have always been close allies of the United States. But the interest of the Trump administration was even more aligned with Israel and Saudi Arabia, and this is what motivated Trump to quit the JCPOA, even though the United Nations had acknowledged that Iran was abiding by all the constraints and the obligations that were placed upon it under the nuclear deal. As mandated under the deal, Iran had cut down its nuclear enrichment, and it was in the process of shutting down its nuclear weapons program. But the sudden and unilateral withdrawal of the United States from the deal and the imposition of strict economic sanctions against Iran led to a significant escalation in tensions between US and Iran, and it also provided a window of opportunity for regional rival Israel to target Iran with a series of overt and covert operations that were designed to target not just Iran's nuclear weapons program but also to target Iran's influence in the region. As a result, Israel carried out a series of bombings in Syria, where the Bashar al-Assad government is seen as a close ally of Iran, and this had allowed Iran to nurture a number of militant outfits in Syria who would target the interests of Israel and Saudi Arabia. So these camps in Syria sponsored by Iran were bombed by Israel through overt operations, and its intelligence agency, the Mossad, also launched a number of covert operations targeted against Iran's nuclear secrets and nuclear scientists. Reportedly in 2018, the Mossad carried out a daring operation inside Iran and stole top secret nuclear documents. Then since many years, the Mossad is known to assassinate top nuclear scientists of Iran in order to derail Iran's nuclear weapons program. So this window had allowed Israel and even Saudi Arabia to weaken Iran's influence in the region through their overt and covert operations. and this had led to a significant escalation of tensions between these countries. But now, the Biden administration, which is all set to replace the Trump administration, has promised to go back to the nuclear deal with the sole focus of preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear bomb, and it is quite clear that the Biden administration wouldn't be so bothered about Iran's regional rivalries with Israel and Saudi Arabia. So just a few weeks before Joe Biden could be inaugurated as the President of the United States, there was a high-profile assassination in Iran recently. A top nuclear scientist of Iran was assassinated, and Iran has blamed this attack on Israel. Interestingly, Israel has not denied these claims made by Iran, which clearly points to its involvement in the assassination of the nuclear scientist. So the writer is of the opinion that this assassination was designed to instigate Iran deliberately before Biden takes power, because if Iran were to retaliate against this assassination, it could lead to an escalation in tensions in the region, and this would cut off the path for diplomacy that would be available for the Biden administration. But as of now, Iran has sought to play it safe, even though it has vowed retaliation against Israel, and it has chosen for the time being to not carry out any sort of military retaliation in the region, either against Israel or Saudi Arabia. So this calibrated approach of Iran leaves some hope that diplomacy is still possible and might allow the Biden administration to rework the nuclear deal and provide for stability in the region. But however, Iran has already taken a calculated step in order to step up tensions if required. Iran's parliament, which is dominated by the hardline factions, has passed a law which mandates the Iranian government to stop UN inspection of its nuclear sites. Basically, the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors who were given access to Iran's nuclear sites as a part of the nuclear deal, their access would be revoked as per this law. Next, the Iranian parliament has mandated the government to step up nuclear enrichment, which currently was contained to below 5%, to 20% enriched uranium, which is one step away from 90% enrichment that is needed for the development of nuclear weapons, and hence 90% enriched uranium is also known as weapons-grade uranium. This law passed by the Iranian parliament gives a 2-month notice to the European partners of the nuclear deal to ease the economic sanctions on Iran, and this is basically a calculated risk that Iran is taking, and if the Biden administration comes back to the negotiating table, then Iran can easily reverse this policy and go back to diplomatic initiatives. But however, if the US fails to negotiate, and if Israel and Saudi Arabia keep targeting Iran with these overt and covert attacks, then Iran could easily escalate the tensions by stepping up its nuclear weapons program. So these volatile developments in the West Asia region is bound to directly affect Indian interests because of the economic and strategic stakes that India has in the region. Next, we have an editorial on page number 6 related to the ongoing farmers' protests. But since we have covered this topic repeatedly, let's just focus on the crux of the editorial. See, the editorial is insisting that the government must first implement the proposals that it has made in order to pacify the farmers who have been protesting before engaging in further talks with the protesters. See, during the latest round of negotiations between the government and the farmer leaders, the government has offered a written assurance and a guarantee to implement minimum support prices, and it has also proposed to carry out several amendments to the Farm Acts with regard to dispute resolution, registration of traders, ensuring parity between APMC mandis and private mandis, and several other concerns that have been raised by the farmers. So in the context of these proposals being offered by the government, the editorial is insisting that the government must first implement them before proceeding with any talks. Because the editorial acknowledges the genuine concerns and fears that have been raised by the farmers, as they believe that they might be exploited by the market forces under the new laws. The government has claimed by opening up farm trading and farm marketing to the market forces, the middlemen would be eliminated and the farmers can directly strike deals with the buyer, especially large corporates, which would help increase the income of the farmers. But however, one cannot ignore the fact that when it comes to the question of food security and farmer welfare, farming and trading of agricultural produce can never be completely exposed to the market forces. And this is a belief that is held even by some of the developed countries, which are some of the most free open markets. And even the WTO supports some form of government intervention on behalf of the farmers. See, there is no doubt that India's agriculture sector is in desperate need of reforms. But however, these reforms should not completely expose the farm sector to the market forces, and they cannot be introduced just by the will of the government. This requires wider consultation with all the stakeholders, especially the farmer organizations, and the surety of government support that they have always enjoyed should be guaranteed by the government, and any reforms that are introduced should take into account the genuine concerns and fears that are being expressed by the stakeholders. So it is in this context that the editorial is of the opinion that the government has a responsibility to first implement the proposals that have been made before proceeding with further talks with the farmers. Next, we have another editorial on page number 6 that deals with the approval for COVID-19 vaccines. See, recently we had discussed that 3 pharmaceutical companies had applied for emergency use authorization for their COVID-19 vaccines with the Drug Controller General of India. This included Pfizer, which has already gained approval in few countries such as United Kingdom, Canada, Bahrain, etc. And it also included Indian companies that are developing indigenous vaccines such as Bharat Biotech. And it also included the Serum Institute of India, which is manufacturing the Oxford vaccine by tying up with AstraZeneca. But this led many to believe that the pharmaceutical companies were displaying unnecessary rush and haste to seek emergency authorization, even without having displayed the complete safety and the efficacy of the vaccine. But thankfully, the expert committee of the Drug Controller General of India has put the proposals on hold by citing a lack of complete trial data provided by these companies. Because especially Bharat Biotech and Serum Institute of India, they have just begun their phase 3 trials in the country, and this crucial data is yet to be made available to the regulatory authorities. Unlike Pfizer's vaccine, which has at least received approvals in few other countries, the vaccine candidates of Bharat Biotech and Serum Institute of India is yet to be approved. In fact, no country in the world has yet approved the Oxford University vaccine, and India's DCGI has taken the right decision to put the emergency use authorization proposal on hold and wait for complete data from phase 3 trials. Because when it comes to the adoption of any vaccine, and when it comes to the public's trust and faith in any vaccine, its safety and efficacy is of utmost importance. And just because we are facing a pandemic, and just because we are looking for quick solutions, shouldn't push any company or any government to rush through the trial process and gain emergency approvals in haste. So in this context, the editorial praises the expert committee of the Drug Controller General of India for taking a judicious decision by putting a hold on the proposal to grant emergency use authorization for these vaccines. Now let's take up the practice questions for today. Which of the following statements are correct? Anthrax is a disease caused by Bacillus anthracis, a spore-forming virus. It is known to affect only humans. It had been developed as a bioweapon by a number of countries. Amongst the given statements, only the third statement is correct, so option D is the right answer. See, anthrax is indeed caused by Bacillus anthracis, but it is not a virus, it is a spore-forming bacteria. And the second statement is also incorrect because anthrax affects not just humans, but it can affect animals as well. So the correct answer would be option D, 3 only. This question has been asked because we have a related article on page number 4. According to this article, there has been a breakout of anthrax in the Pobitora Wildlife Sanctuary of Assam, which has led to the death of a couple of elephants. So to contain the possible spread of the disease, a vaccination drive has been started in order to protect the other animals. Let's look at the next question. Which of the following committee or committees is or are related to the conservation of Western Ghats? Madhav Gadgil Committee, Dr. K. Kasthurirangan Committee, Urjit Patel Committee, or both A and B? The correct answer is option D, both A and B. That is, both the Madhav Gadgil Committee and the Dr. K. Kasthurirangan Committee are related to the conservation of Western Ghats. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 8, the Karnataka government has said that there won't be any forcible eviction of local villages in the Western Ghats region that fall under the eco-sensitive zone classification as defined by the Dr. K. Kasthurirangan report. See, in order to protect the sensitive ecology and biodiversity of the Western Ghats, the Environment Ministry had constituted a Western Ghats ecology expert panel headed by Madhav Gadgil. The mandate of the Madhav Gadgil Committee was to recommend the implementation of eco-sensitive zones in the Western Ghats in order to regulate economic and industrial activities so that the biodiversity of the region could be conserved and protected. So the Madhav Gadgil Committee came out with a set of recommendations that were completely pro-environment, that is pro-conservation of the Western Ghats, and it recommended the zonification of Western Ghats into eco-sensitive Zone 1, Zone 2 and Zone 3 with varying degrees of regulation with regard to economic and industrial activities. But these recommendations of the Madhav Gadgil Committee were staunchly opposed by all the state governments that are part of the Western Ghats region and as well as by the local people and the local industry who already have major investments and stakes in the region. Following these massive protests, the Government of India, that is the Environment Ministry, constituted another committee under Dr. K. Kasthurirangan in order to review the recommendations of the Madhav Gadgil Committee. The Kasthurirangan Committee then came out with a report which tried to strike a balance between environment conservation and economic development. But even the recommendations of the Kasthurirangan Committee was opposed by the state governments and by the locals, and hence, as of now, eco-sensitive zones have not been implemented in the Western Ghats region. Let's look at the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? The ADMM Plus is a platform for ASEAN and its 8 dialogue partners. It focuses on maritime security, counter-terrorism, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and peacekeeping operations in the Indo-Pacific region. Its member countries are also the members of the East Asia Summit. All the 3 statements are correct, so option C is the right answer. Let's look at the next question. Freedom of navigation and overflight has been recognized under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, UN Convention on Contracts for the International Sale of Goods, UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or the UN Convention on Environmental Modification. The correct answer is option C. Freedom of navigation and overflight has been recognized under the UNCLOS. These 2 questions were asked because we have a related article on page number 10. India's Defence Minister Rajnath Singh has participated in a virtual summit of the ADMM Plus. See, ADMM stands for ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting. This is a meeting including the 10 defence ministers of the 10 ASEAN countries, that is the 10 Southeast Asian countries. Following the ADMM summit, the 10 ASEAN defence ministers, they hold the ADMM Plus with the 8 dialogue partners of ASEAN, which includes India, Australia, New Zealand, China, Japan, South Korea, Russia and the United States. Both the ADMM and the ADMM Plus is focused on maritime security, counter-terrorism and disaster management in the Indo-Pacific region. And these 18 countries or 18 members, they are also members of the East Asia Summit. So during the latest ADMM Plus Summit, India's Defence Minister has highlighted the importance of maintaining maritime security in the Indo-Pacific region, and he has called upon all the member countries to uphold the freedom of navigation and overflight, especially in the South China Sea region, as per the norms of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. This is basically India's indirect reference to China's aggressive claims with regard to the South China Sea dispute. Let's look at the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? Air transport bubbles are temporary arrangements between 2 countries aimed at restarting commercial passenger flights when regular international flights are suspended as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The benefits are reciprocal in nature. It provides for visa-free travel to these countries. Amongst the given statements, the 3rd statement is incorrect, so option B is the right answer. Air bubble agreements are being signed between 2 respective countries in order to resume commercial flights, which has been completely disrupted by the pandemic, and these benefits are reciprocal in nature, available to airlines of both the countries. But however, air bubbles do not allow for visa-free travel. The regular visa and immigration norms still apply. So the 3rd statement is incorrect and option B is the right answer. This question has been asked because on page number 10 we have a related article. According to this article, India and Nepal have signed an air bubble agreement to restart commercial flights between the 2 countries. Let's look at the next question. The conflict in Western Sahara involves which 2 countries? The correct answer is option B. It involves Morocco and Algeria. See, the Western Sahara region over here has been disputed between Morocco, Algeria, and at one point it even included Mauritania. See, this whole region was once a colony of France and Spain. After these countries left, a dispute emerged over the Western Sahara region, and both Morocco and Mauritania have occupied a few parts of the Western Sahara. And in this region, there is a national liberation movement led by the Polisario Front, which is backed by Algeria. But Morocco looks at the Polisario Front as a violent insurgent outfit, and there is a long-standing dispute between Morocco and Algeria with regard to the activities of the Polisario Front in the Western Sahara. The Polisario Front claims to represent the Sahrawi people, who are the native people of the Western Sahara region, and it seeks to establish an independent country known as SADR, which stands for Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. So in this dispute between Morocco and Algeria involving the Polisario Front, Morocco has always received the support of United States and Israel. And now, in an interesting development, the Donald Trump administration has recognized Morocco's sovereignty over the Western Sahara region, and in return, Morocco has agreed to recognize Israel. So this makes Morocco the fourth Arab nation after the UAE, Bahrain and Sudan to recognize Israel. Let's look at the next question. The Asian Development Outlook is published by the Asian Development Bank. Option A is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 14, the Asian Development Outlook published by the ADB predicts India's growth figures at around -8% for the current financial year as compared to the -9% that was predicted earlier. Now let's take up a question from the 2017 prelims paper. In the context of mitigating the impending global warming due to anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide, which of the following can be the potential sites for carbon sequestration? See, carbon sequestration is basically a geo-engineering technique to mitigate climate change. Under geo-engineering, it is believed that the geography of the earth can be engineered in order to tackle global warming and climate change. So one of the approaches under geo-engineering is carbon sequestration, under which the greenhouse gas carbon dioxide is injected into carbon sinks, which are usually geological formations located deep inside the earth. So look at the options: abandoned and uneconomic coal seams, depleted oil and gas reservoirs, subterranean deep saline formations. All the three are correct, and all the three geological formations can be used to sequester carbon. So the correct answer is option D, 1, 2 and 3. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question: examine how virtual learning can impact pedagogy in India. The second question: Iran is enhancing its nuclear program, which can be reversed if talks with the US are revived. Comment. So kindly write an answer for these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. This concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.